Oh, Anissa, can you give me screen sharing privileges?
Yes. Give all panelists. Okay, you should be good.
Okay. Okay, can you guys see the screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, awesome, thanks. All right, hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to Stereotypes, Prejudice, and Discrimination, Understanding Biases from a Mental Health Perspective. So thank you all for joining us. We have Anika, our wonderful speaker here. So feel free to go ahead and get settled while people are still coming in. In the chat box, please share kind of what brings you here today. I know that this is a touchy subject and we're all here for different reasons, some of us to learn more about this topic at hand. So feel free to go ahead and share and we'll just go ahead and get started. Okay, so while this may feel like a therapeutic webinar, you may feel that you're learning some things. I just want to let everyone know that this is not a substitute for mental health treatment, and the information here is meant as a supplement to and not a substitute for the knowledge, skill, and judgment of qualified psychiatrists, psychologists, physicians, and healthcare professionals. If you have a health, medical, or disability question or concern, please consult the appropriate person, a physician, or another healthcare professional. And if you experience an emergency, please call 911. And again, I just want to repeat that although this may feel therapeutic, it is not a substitute for mental health treatment. Okay, also want to let everyone know that this is being recorded. So it's for educational purposes and it will be shared. So if you'd like to remain anonymous, please change your name on Zoom to anonymous. And you can do that by scrolling over your speaker pane. Once you scroll over your speaker pane, it will light up with 3 blue dots in the upper right corner. If you click those dots, you can scroll down to rename. Just want to let you know that even though we're being recorded and if your video is not showing, that may not impact the recording, but things that you share in the chat box, that is being recorded. So if you'd like to remain anonymous, please just go ahead and change your name now. Okay, and this workshop is being sponsored by Samaritan Counseling Center, Hawaii. Samaritan Counseling Center received a grant from the City and County of Honolulu, the Grants and Aid Program, to provide these workshops. They've all now moved virtual considering the situation with COVID, but Samaritan received the grant, and Samaritan is a interfaith nonprofit organization on Oahu whose mission is to provide professional and accessible behavioral health counseling services sensitive to the traditions of people in Hawaii. The main caveat with this is that Samaritan Counseling Center accepts patients regardless of their ability to pay. So if you're looking for services, please feel free to reach out. There are 6 locations across Oahu, and they're currently offering video and phone telehealth services. All right, our next sponsor is NAMI Hawaii, and I'll let Nisa step in and speak about that.
Hi guys, so at NAMI we have a lot of free programs right now. We have our support group. We have a few different support groups. The next one is our Women on Wellness one, and it's this Friday. And then we have various online family support groups as well. We have a family and friends presentation coming up August 1st and August 8th. You can register on Eventbrite. That link should be on our website soon, or send us an email and we'll send you more information. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Nisa. Okay, so our speaker, Anika Gearhart, she is right there if you want to wave. She's a psychology instructor at Leeward Community College, and she balances her time teaching with conducting research and writing her dissertation, as she's in the final leg of her PhD program at UH Manoa, and it's the Cognition, Neuroscience, and Social Concentration through the graduate psychology program there. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology, and she has a master's in psychology as well. And some of her research interests and expertise include multisensory integration, joint attention, and neurocorrelates of social cognition phenomena. So she is very brilliant, very bright, and I have no doubt that she'll bring a level of knowledge and expertise about this subject. And so without further ado, I'll let her go ahead and get started.
All right, welcome everybody. Let me just share my screen really quickly here. All right, so my name is Anika, as Glendon said. I'm very excited to be back here. I gave one other webinar for Samaritan Counseling Center, and I think that both they and NAMI are really phenomenal organizations that do a lot of amazing work here in Hawaii. I'm very excited to give another workshop. And this is going to be a workshop rather than a webinar. So I do expect some interaction from participants, and I do truly expect for you to be participants rather than sort of passive receivers of information. So it's helpful generally to have something to write with so that you can sort of reflect privately as well. And then the rest of it will be using polls in the chat box. So today we're here to talk about how explicit and implicit biases impact relationships and mental health. And I want to start with the major caveat that my expertise is in something called sociocognitive neuroscience. And what that means is that I'm fairly good at looking at and performing research that looks at how various different tasks that are social and not social in nature change cognitive mechanisms and mapping those using brain mapping. But I'm not a clinical psychologist, which means that we're going to spend a lot of our time talking about formation of bias, because that's really where my expertise is. We'll also kind of talk a little bit about the impact on relationships and mental health a little bit later in the presentation as well, just so that everybody's aware. I always find it helpful to give a little bit more of a backstory about myself, just so that I can kind of develop a full picture of a person for you. So again, my name is Anika. I am happily married for now 2 years. We just celebrated our anniversary last week, actually, our 2-year anniversary. And I have a wonderful family. We are from New Mexico, including 3 sisters and a wonderful mother. They're taking the world by storm in various different areas of expertise, including math, law, cancer advocacy, and research. So just wonderful people. I do not have any kids, but I do have a couple of pets. I do enjoy a couple of different hobbies, and like any good eccentric professor, one of my hobbies slash what's helpful for my giving an education in my classroom is I actually collect a number of animal brains, and I use those to talk about the different structures of the brain and how the role that those play in our behavior. So a couple of fun facts about me. I also have a disclaimer of my own, and it's the exact same disclaimer I would use in any classroom that I teach in. This is not the only sensitive topic I talk about in my classroom. There's a number of them, as you can imagine, in psychology. So, well, I understand that it can be uncomfortable and it can be difficult. I do encourage everybody to be honest and thoughtful throughout this, this workshop. And even though I do encourage that honest and thoughtful discussion, I just want to, everybody to remember that there are some rules for communication in this space. They are that we don't talk over others. Now, obviously, you're not going to be asked to speak over a microphone today, but the same thing goes for the chat box. So acknowledging each other's points and making sure that we validate each other's experiences. We don't speak without evidence. So again, sensitive topic. So sometimes people can have opinions that are obviously sort of offensive, right? We want to make sure that we're not making claims without evidence. So we speak to facts. We don't use ad hominem, so we don't attack each other personally. You're always welcome to argue with somebody if you have a valid point, and again, it is backed up by evidence, but we don't attack who somebody is. And we don't negate other people's experiences. An example of that would be saying, not all blank, right? Not all people do this. Again, not negating other people's experiences. So those are sort of the rules for communication in this class. And then I further want to qualify, true psychologist qualifying everything I say, that we're taking as fact in this particular workshop that implicit bias is a thing that exists. There is a lot of research, and this is just several that I grabbed that happen to be a little bit more noteworthy, but I mean a lot of research. This one I find particularly interesting on the neural correlates of bias to suggest that implicit bias is a thing and that it exists. So we're taking that as a fact. It's not something I'd like to debate in this particular workshop. All right, so we're going to skip through our warm-up because we just did one. And we'll talk a little bit about the agenda for today. We are going to talk and spend a lot of our time today on how biases form. So we're going to talk about essentially cognitive distortions, not the clinical kind, but how our brain malfunctions essentially, even when it's functioning normally. We'll talk a little bit about different types of bias. There's lots of different ways that the brain can be wrong, and we'll talk about each of those. How biases affect our relationships, so how they affect us socially, how they affect our mental health, whether we're the person that has the bias or the person experiencing the bias. And then lastly and importantly, what can we do about biases as well. So that's what I'm hoping that we can cover for today. So let us start our conversation today on how biases form. And we're going to actually start in kind of an odd place. We're going to think about how the brain actually perceives reality. And we're going to start with one of my favorite exercises to do actually when I talk about sensation and perception. It's something called sine wave speech. Sine wave speech is when you take normal speech and you remove all of the acoustic signature of a human voice. And so you're left with what is essentially a garbled, mingled audio that just sounds like sort of whistles and clicks. And I'll tell you why we're starting with this in a few minutes, obviously. So all I'd like for you to do right this second is to listen to the first audio track and then tell me what it sounds like. So I'm going to go ahead and play that now. Hoping you can all hear this.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
So did anybody hear anything? I'll listen to it. I'll play it one more time.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
So we should have heard what sounded like garbled, whistled sounds. Let's go ahead and listen to the second audio track. So this is the original audio before it was garbled.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
And we'll listen to it one more time.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
Are you able to hear the words? And if so, can you go ahead and plug them in the chat box for me? Yeah, the first version does sound a little bit alien. So for the second version, I'm hoping you heard some words. You should have heard the words jazz and swing fans like fast music. Yep, exactly right. All right, so now what I would like for us to do is listen to the first track again.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
Was anybody able to hear the words in that originally garbled? Excellent. Yep. So we all should have heard it. There are a couple of very rare disorders where people are not able to perceive this illusion, but seeing as that's less than 0.001% of the population, I'm guessing we probably all heard that. Now, why am I playing this? This is an example of how humans process the world. There's something called bottom-up and top-down processing. So we process information in our world differently depending on whether it's new or we previously experienced it, whether it's threatening or not threatening. We don't process all stimuli or all things in our environment the same. So we use something called bottom-up and top-down processing. And these are just another word for the ways that we organize information. So bottom-up processing is when we process things feature by feature. This is what you use when you're first faced with that really garbled track in the beginning. There isn't any sort of pattern that you have for perceiving that track. So it just sounds like whistles and beeps to you. There's no real words in the very beginning. Another example of this would be learning a new language, right? Or learning a new alphabet. So if I was to write something in Russian up here, I don't know Russian, I'm just using this as an example, and you are not familiar with that language, it's just going to look like a series of letters. It's not going to look like words because we don't have the neural pattern for recognizing that language. But a really fascinating thing happens when we actually have a pattern, which is that we use something called top-down processing. And this is when we process something using our expectations or a learned pattern. An example of this would be reading something in your native language. So if I was to write an English word up here, all of you would process that, or the words that are currently on the screen, you would process that as a complete series of words because we have a pattern for what those words mean. Similarly, in the second example, when I gave you that original speech, you now have a neural pattern that you can use and impose on the garbled audio. that helps you to make sense of the audio, even though you couldn't understand it before. So all of this is just a nice long-winded way of saying, actually, I forgot I had an example here, so we'll talk about that in a second. So I want you to think about if we applied this to people. This is actually something that works phenomenally well when we're encountering everyday objects, everyday scenarios, but it breaks down like most of our mental shortcuts when we apply it to people. The reality is we filter everything through our expectations. So they shape everything that we see and remember. And this means that our expectations mean that we see some things and we don't see others. In other words, this can be summarized by saying that we experience the world through our expectations and our experiences. So we're not actually getting the full picture of what we see in our world. All right, let's go ahead and do another activity. I'm going to go ahead and play a video. And if your internet is particularly laggy, feel free to minimize Zoom and watch it on your own and come back. But I'm going to go ahead and play it for all of us right now. And while we're watching the video, I would like for you to count the number of passes between the players in white. That'll make sense when I open the video. So give me a second, open it up. And again, you will see a couple of different basketball teams. I want you to count the number of passes between the players who are wearing white. All right, so hopefully you're all able to hear.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13.
I'm wondering how many of us got that correct. But more importantly, how many of you saw the moonwalking bear? So go ahead and answer the poll. Anissa, if you could put the poll up. Did anybody notice the moonwalking bear? Oh, I put gorilla. Sub moonwalking bear for gorilla there. Sorry about that. All right, so we can go ahead and I think close the poll. Excellent. Yep. So this almost perfectly replicates. It's actually a little bit better. Some of the research on inattentional blindness. So what do I mean by moonwalking bear? This is what I mean.
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So that is an example of something called inattentional blindness. And I am willing to bet, so it seems like the vast majority of us completely missed the example of the moonwalking bear. How on earth is that possible? Well, we filter everything through the goals that we have. So we go through life having specific tasks and specific goals, even if there's something as simple as I'm going to get up and make breakfast, or I'm looking for my keys. And we tend to miss anything that's not related to that goal. So when you're focusing on the players in white, you miss anything that's not related to that particular task. In other words, we miss a lot of information because we're focused on those specific goals. And we're also more likely to miss information if it doesn't fit a specific narrative that we're used to. This is something called inattentional blindness. Let me give you a more human example. Because again, this is a perfectly normal cognitive distortion. And this means that your brain is functioning completely normally, but it tends to break down when we apply it to people. So let me say, for example, you're meeting candidates for a job and you go to a networking event with that particular goal in mind. Well, we already know that we filter things through the patterns that we create in our brain, right? We talked about that when we talked about top-down processing, that we create these patterns that we sort of see the world through. So we already know that the expectations are shaping the way that we see the world. And we have one goal, which is to meet candidates for a job. Well, what this means is that we already have expectations for what groups of people are going to fit that job or that job well, and which groups are not. And what that means is that we actually end up, we expect some people to be less helpful for our task, and we're more likely to miss entire people that could be good options, or miss things about people that we already sort of expect to be less qualified. So again, something that is completely normal, a normal way of seeing the world, because this is sort of how our brain maintains efficiency, but something that breaks down when we apply it to other people. And it has real world consequences, right? Those that we remember more are more likely to be hired. So we can summarize that by saying that we miss information when it's not relevant to the task that we're completing. All right, on to another activity, so bear with me. So what do you think of when I say the word shark? Just a few words that come to mind. All right, so we've got words like beautiful, water, intense, dangerous, misunderstood. I'm inclined to agree with that one. Swimming, scary, cartilaginous. Love that. Jaws, sharp, excellent. Now, how did you think about that word? So what was your thought process? Friends, not food. Now, how about if I show you this picture? Does anything change? Same animal, different picture. Did anything change for you? Still danger. Yep, that was a good first word to choose. Good, yeah, so if the feeling might have changed in response. Hungry, scary. Jaws, yeah, that's a good one. So the ways that we represent all of that information, we use something called a schema. And a schema is really just a mental mind map. So it's a way of, if we think about it psychologically, it's a way of sort of organizing vast amounts of information. Biologically, we actually know this exists as massive neural networks that organize all this information in our neocortex and a couple of areas of our brain. And those organization networks are essentially ways of categorizing all the different concepts. This is actually an extremely useful feature to have in your brain. Imagine what it's like walking through a forest with and without schemas. So if you're walking through a forest with schemas, you have a sort of general schema for the things that you have. It means that you sort of understand what is a tree, what is dangerous, what is not dangerous, what is something that you can stand and admire, what you need to run away from. If you don't have that schema, you literally have to learn about every single piece of information one at a time. So again, it's a way for your brain to conserve energy. But schemas are also very subjective. They change based on our experiences. They can change very quickly, and they're very subjective, right? I think I said subjective, but they change essentially based on our most current experience and our mental mood. Just like when I showed you the two different pictures of the same animal, we sort of brought different words to mind, even though it was the same animal. Similarly, our representations of people can also be extremely biased because of what we experience in our world. So yet another version of something that's extremely efficient when we think about organizing objects and organizing environments, but inefficient and harmful when it comes to actually organizing information about people, which is true of most of our mental shortcuts. So we can essentially summarize that by saying that we organize concepts and thought networks that are vulnerable to both situations and the suggestions that are made. All right, so we've talked about a couple of different mental maps or mental shortcuts, I'm sorry. Let's sort of put this together in a model. So we know that experience creates a sort of map or a pattern of what to expect that we apply to all the new experiences, just like we applied that pattern we created through the original audio to the first audio. We notice the things that match our expectations, and our expectations then influence our goals. So the tasks that we have determine what we notice and then what we don't notice. And we organize what we know into maps called schema, which continue to inform our expectations. So we have essentially a cycle here. have experience informing expectations, informing our goals, informing what we notice, which then becomes part of our schema, which then influence our expectations. So it's essentially a constant cycle of cognitive distortion. So we can say, to summarize, that our schema are influenced by what we see in our experiences. Yet another activity. So again, fairly interactive. All right, so I'll start with the first question. What is the most dangerous animal in the world? Any guesses? And the first thing that comes to mind, don't assume that I'm tricking you, even though I am. All right, snake, rhinoceros, poisonous snake, human. That's one of the ones I hear the most. I generally hear humans. I think I also commonly hear lions and tigers. All right, we're going to come back to that question in our next slide. And then go ahead and answer the poll when it pops up. Which of these two lottery tickets would you be more likely to choose? We'll take a couple more seconds so we can answer the question. All right, so we can go ahead and close the poll. Perfect. I love having so many people present. When I do this with a smaller group, sometimes you don't replicate the results, but this is exactly what is expected. So most people chose the second number of the two options. All right, so again, we're going to come back to that particular answer. Last one. What is likely this person's profession? So the person in the picture. What is our best guess? Trainer, athlete. I have a feeling that some of you have taken Psych 100 before, because I see some of the expected answers. All right, so we're going to go ahead and come back to each of these questions as I describe a couple of new terms. So one of the things we know about cognition is that we tend to use the information that's most readily available to us. So whatever information is sort of emphasized, whether by other people or from our own past experiences, tend to be what we remember. So for example, many of you probably put things like sharks. I know some of you put snakes, put spiders, based on probably either things that you've seen before in the media or seen in a documentary or something you've experienced. But the most dangerous animal in the world is actually a mosquito, right? Not something that we tend to think about, although I think Kelsey got that one right. Because mosquitoes transmit dangerous diseases that kill millions of people. So we're using the information that tends to be portrayed about the topic of danger, right? That sharks are dangerous, that tigers are dangerous, to answer that question. This is something called the availability heuristic. And again, it's a sort of mental shortcut we take to answer questions and make decisions. We also tend to represent categories of information using what information we have present for us. So for example, when I gave you two different examples of a lottery ticket to choose, most of you chose the second one, probably because it looked the most random. So random is something that we sort of think is a good representative, a good characteristic for a lottery ticket to have, despite the fact that they're both equally likely to be chosen, right? We chose the one that seemed like it was more random. This is something called the representative heuristic. And when we apply it to people, it becomes a little bit more problematic. So for example, when I gave you the one picture, right, we all have sort of assumptions based on what that person looks like in the activity they're completing at one point in time. So generally what the answer I get to this is trainer, CrossFit trainer, weightlifter, but he could very easily be a doctor. He could just as easily be a dentist. He could be a lawyer, right? We don't know, given the amount of information. And I did see some of you had answered that as well. So again, examples of sort of heuristics or mental shortcuts. Both of these save us a lot of time, again, with objects, but they do mean that we make a lot of incorrect judgments for people. So some of you may have experienced in the past somebody crossing the street to avoid you, right? I know that some of my male friends have talked about that as an example of when they felt uncomfortable as well. Let's see, or we could of course have inadvertently done it ourselves. And this is an example of sort of using the representative heuristic to make judgments about people. Again, something that's actually fairly natural, but that doesn't mean that it's something that we can't work on. Another example would be, if we think about the availability heuristic, believing women are weaker because we see them less represented in sports. This is something that we still commonly see. Or even calling the police on someone because they fit sort of a limited description of what we've seen before as being a criminal. So again, a mental shortcut that makes a lot of sense when we think about it in the general world, but sort of breaks down when we apply it to people. We can summarize this by saying that we use mental shortcuts to retrieve information from what we talked about before, which is our mental map for our schema. All right, so you've made it through the sort of science-heavy part, hopefully unscathed. And now we will talk a little bit about types of bias. And we will start with a quick activity. So this is actually what I do with my students, to ask you a very simple question. So when I ask you to picture a sort of typical Hollywood-esque professor, what comes to mind? So if you could answer the poll when it pops up. If you're having any trouble accessing the polls, they're down at the bottom. So there should be a little ribbon that has chat, participant, and 3 bars. If you click on the 3 bars, the poll will pop up. Let's take a couple more seconds so that we can answer that. All right, perfect. So let's see. Yep, and again, it's mostly what I expected. So for the most part, when we think about that sort of Hollywood stereotypical professor, we think of somebody who is largely male, largely old, and largely white. My follow-up question would be, why do you think that image of a stereotypical professor doesn't look that much like me, despite the fact that I'm sort of a real-life version of a professor sitting in front of you? What do we think? Yeah, that's a good point, Victor. I'm assuming some people's answers were swayed by the image. But that was also sort of part of my point, that I chose an image that I think is very typical, bodies kind of a typical professor. You have a good point there. Stephanie, you kill me. She says, do they have tenure? Definitely, yep. So how we see people on TV, what's portrayed in the media, elbow patches. Kelsey, you're so funny. Definitely, yep. So we're swayed by the things around us. And obviously, I'm not a movie star. You probably have never seen me in a role reprising a professor, because I've never been in one. So we see what we see in the movies and what we see even in real life. There's still women and people of color are still very much underrepresented in academia, especially in some of the upper echelons of academia. And some of you also noticed what I was going for here, which is stereotypes. So stereotypes are essentially the result of applying all of those mental shortcuts that we talked about before, but instead of applying them to objects, applying them to people. So we can define them essentially as ideas that connect this sort of oversimplified, generalized traits or large or overgeneralized beliefs to entire groups of people. So, for example, thinking about all professors as being old and white, etc. We can sort of summarize that by saying that we overgeneralize and simplify groups of people, which in turn creates stereotypes. A little bit lesser known is something that's called subtyping. And subtyping is what happens when we encounter somebody that doesn't fit the category, sort of stereotypes of a category. Interestingly enough, even though it would seem to make sense from a sort of efficiency standpoint, we don't actually just update our category when we encounter somebody who doesn't fit a stereotype. We create a whole brand new category for them. So this, as I mentioned before, is called subtyping, and it's estimated that we actually need to encounter about 20 encounters with somebody who doesn't fit the stereotype before we actually update our category, which is pretty phenomenally inefficient, right? So this is actually something that's not very well explained by neuroscience right now. It doesn't seem to really make sense with what we know about the brain and how it functions. In other words, you would need to encounter about 20 other professors that look a little bit like me or just don't look like your stereotype of a professor to really update that stereotype so that it changes in your mind. This is obviously a lot of encounters if we think about areas where people are live in an area where there aren't a lot of people that don't look like them or think like them or sort of not fit the boxes that they have, right? All right, so moving on to a little conversation about emotions. As we have talked so far mostly about cognitive processes, but we've kind of left out the conversation about emotions. Emotions are actually, and feelings are sort of a big component of schemas. And we can talk about how we evaluate the world as being something called an attitude. So that's how we evaluate objects, events, and people. And there's sort of the emotional attachment we have to people or objects or events. It's important to keep in mind that attitudes are subjective. They're defined through experience and something we haven't talked about that much yet called social learning. And even more importantly for our conversation today, we also know that we have attitudes that we know a lot about and we can describe, and we have attitudes that we're not aware of as well. We call attitudes that we can talk about explicit attitudes. So for example, if I asked you, how do you feel about bacon? How do you feel about pizza with pineapples on it? You could probably give me a very definite answer about how you feel about those things. But we also have implicit attitudes, and those are attitudes that we cannot describe and that we aren't even necessarily aware that we hold. These can be a little bit more difficult to measure and to study. And then lastly, we have prejudices, and prejudices are essentially the emotional aspect of bias. So they're the feelings that we have about entire groups, and they're generally unfair and based on categorizations or oversimplifications. So here is an example of a banned ad. I actually use this a lot when we talk about persuasion and compliance in my class. And we're going to use it to answer a couple of questions. So don't worry, I'm just as offended by it as you are. First of all, what explicit attitudes does this advertisement reflect? So if you were putting yourself in the shoes of the advertiser, what do you think he's trying to tell people, tell his audience? What is he appealing to? Kind of a hard question. Sure, yep, men who drink beer, sure. Masculinity is a good question, or a good answer, sorry. Beer is the only thing that matters, absolutely. Yes, if I could summarize this in 2 words, I definitely would say toxic masculinity. I think that's a probably good way. Importance of beer. Good, and then Maricel, you actually answered the second question I was going to ask, which is, what are some implicit attitudes that this advertisement reflects? So what are the things that we know that or we think that the advertiser might think about women that he's not actually portraying, or he's not actually even maybe aware that he thinks about women? So I saw that Maricel had said that women are people pleasers. Absolutely. She's so inept, but he can be tolerant. Absolutely. Yep. So those are sort of the implicit attitudes that are portrayed in this particular advertisement. So it might not necessarily be something that the advertiser is coming right out and saying, but it's absolutely something that he's appealing to. This is actually a banned advertisement from the 50s. I think we can all probably guess why it was banned. All right, so moving on from there, let's talk a little bit about implicit and explicit biases. The reason we're here, so it only took me 40 minutes to get into our main topic. It's pretty good for me. So implicit and explicit biases. Biases are a preference for one thing over another thing, if we put it really simply. They don't just apply to people. We can prefer one thing over another, but when we apply them to people, it means that we preference generally for a group of people over another. Just like attitudes, we can have explicit and implicit biases. And because they're implicit, people often don't believe that they are biased or they're not aware of their biases. This is actually something that's fairly normal, but it doesn't mean that it's something that we shouldn't address. The reason why I say it's fairly normal is because it's very uncomfortable to think about yourself as having biases you're not aware of or attitudes you're not aware of, because it means that you have to accept the fact that your brain is very much flawed. In and of itself, that's a very uncomfortable feeling. People often do have implicit biases, and implicit biases are essentially prejudices or stereotypes that we're not aware that we have. And here we define our third type of bias, which is discrimination. And discrimination is when we act on our prejudices or our stereotypes. So it's when we actually behave differently or treat people differently based on those biases that we have. All right, so this is going to be, I think, one of our longer activities. I hope that you will participate. We're going to take something called an IAT, or an implicit association test. Before we take it, I will actually go ahead and put the link in the chat box. You absolutely do not have to, obviously, but I do find it to be a useful tool. It was designed by Harvard researchers to test implicit attitudes, so attitudes we're not aware that we have. And it is a very controversial test, not just among the broader public, but certainly among psychological researchers. Some of that controversy has a lot of merit, and so I left an article in the slides, I'm assuming they'll be sent out, that discusses that controversy in depth, because I think it's important to have both sides of any argument when there's good facts to the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the link to the implicit association test in the chat box in a second. And what I'd like for you to do is take a test either where you believe you may have bias for that particular subject, or a test where you don't think you're going to be biased about that particular subject. I'm going to walk you through going into the site in a second. And then we'll answer a couple of questions together. So give me a second and I'll drop the link in the chat box. 1 second. You should see the link in the chat box. And then go ahead and navigate to that link. You can copy it and paste it in an address bar. And we're going to take a couple of minutes to complete this individually. Thank you, Anissa. That's also helpful. Appreciate that. Then we're going to come back and discuss. So when you're done, if you could just come back and put done in the chat box so I know when everybody is done. Again, you're welcome to not take this test if you prefer. You can always sit it out. I'm just gonna, while I share screen, walk you through what that website looks like while you're navigating to it on your own. So on the bottom, if you just click I wish to proceed after you read the information, you should have a list here of different tests, of different possible groups you may show different bias for. So again, selecting either one that you may have bias for or one you may not have bias for. I'm going to go ahead and be quiet so that you can actually take the test, and I will check back in 1 minute. right, I'm just checking back in, and I just want to remind you that when you're done with the test, if you could just write done in the chat box so that I know that you're finished and we can move along. All right, so I'm going to mute myself again for another minute, and I'll check back in. I'll keep the chat box open. Just go ahead and write done when you're done. So I noticed a few people have typed done in the chat box. I'm just going to give us a couple more seconds for anybody else to finish up that wants to take it, and then we'll keep moving on. All right, so I saw a couple more. I'm going to assume that if you're still working on it, you're welcome to keep working on it. I'm going to assume that a lot of us are kind of finishing up or finished up now. All right, so if you took the test, do you agree with your results? And importantly, what do you think might have influenced your results? You're welcome to share what test you took, whether you found any bias or not. Oh, okay, Annie, so you're still working on it. That's perfectly fine. So just join the discussion as you're coming back. I noticed that Cynthia, who happens to be my mother, mentioned her experience. She actually does diversity trainings as well, so it's wonderful to have her here. And she noticed something that's actually fairly typical of when I have my students take it as well, which is that often people take something where they feel like they're part of a particular group. So let's say you're Hispanic and you take a test that tests bias for or against Hispanics, and you find that you're actually biased against a group that you're part of. That's actually fairly common. We can talk a little bit about that in a second. Would anybody else like to share their results? And I know that this can be personal for people, so you're welcome to keep them to yourself if you prefer. All right. You are welcome to share at any point. If not, I'm going to assume that that's something we want to keep to ourselves, and I'm going to move to sort of wrap up types of bias, and then we will take a break. So let's sort of summarize on the things that we learned, and then we'll apply it in the next slide. So first, bias. Bias is essentially just a preference for something versus something else, often unfairly. I'm going to give you silly examples, but I'd like for you to think about ways that this could apply certainly to recent events and to people. In fact, I might give you an example there as well. So again, bias preference for something versus something else, often unfairly. So for example, if we go back to our sharks example, I'm just giving you a silly one first. I could say I'm a biased against sharks because I've seen several scary movies featuring them. So I have a bias against that particular animal. And I know that it's unfair. The stereotype is a generalized and oversimplified thought about a group of people, so it's cognitive. So if I connect the trait of danger with all sharks globally, even those who are not trying to harm me, then I have a stereotype. Now let's think about people as well here, because even though I'm being a bit silly here, I do want us to remember that this is very impactful on people's lives as well. So if we have a bias against a group of people and we start to believe that they're dangerous, then we would have a stereotype. A prejudice is a generalized and oversimplified feeling about a group of people. So for example, we could say that I'm afraid of all sharks because they are sharks rather than because they've done anything. Substitute the group, any group of person there, if you will, and that would be an example of a prejudice. And lastly, we have discrimination. This is action or behavior directed towards an individual or group based on stereotypes or on prejudices. So for example, I sign up for one of those Groupon midnight shark huntings because I believe sharks are dangerous and because I'm afraid of them. Or substituting here something a bit more serious, creating discriminatory policies, something that keeps people out of neighborhoods or out of financial institutions. Those would also be examples of discrimination. And removing assets, so not donating to an organization because it supports a group of people that you are prejudiced or have stereotypes for. All right, so let's do a quick activity. This is actually an example from real life that one of my childhood friends, her parents, unfortunately, this is something that he did. So after watching a documentary on gangs, a man begins to believe that Latino men are dangerous. He becomes afraid and angry of the men in his neighborhood who look like the men in the documentary and supports neighborhood policies that will make it more difficult for Latino individuals to buy a home in the neighborhood. Again, something that one of my friend's parents actually experienced. So it hits very close to home. My first question is, what concepts, if we think about top-down processing or inattentional blindness or availability heuristic, do you see in that scenario that I described? And secondly, because I think it might be a bit easier, so feel free to answer that question. What part of the scenario would you say includes a stereotype? Exactly, yep. Exactly right. So a oversimplified belief about a group of people. And then what part includes the prejudice? So again, a prejudice is an oversimplified or generalized feeling about a group of people. Absolutely, yep. So believing that being afraid or angry. And then lastly, what part includes discrimination? Exactly right. Yep. So it becomes more difficult for Latino men to buy a neighborhood or buy a home in that neighborhood. So you have those three different components, and they are distinct components, but they all act together to contribute to discriminating against people who probably didn't do anything to deserve it. Exactly. Yep. A not in my backyard sort of mindset, which can be extremely dangerous. All right, so let's go ahead and take a break. I know that I, for one, need a very quick snack. We will come back in about 10 minutes, and then we'll continue on with our second part of the workshop. So just to clarify, we'll come back in about 10 minutes. I guess that would be 4:05. right, so if you want to wander back over to your computer, we will get started again here in just a couple seconds. All right, so I hope you had time to go grab something to drink or eat or whatever, just take a break. We're going to jump back in with the second part of our workshop. This will probably be a little bit shorter than the last part and a little bit less science heavy, which I'm sure will make some of us happy. So we're going to start with a conversation about how biases affect our relationships. So far, we've really just talked about individual experience, individual cognition, and we really only talked about the role of things like expectation and goals in forming biases. But there's a whole other part of it that we didn't really talk about, which is social learning. Social learning is actually a really complex topic. There's lots of different types of social learning, ranging from observational learning, which is when we see somebody do something and get rewarded or punished for it, and then we either do it or don't do it. We have vicarious learning, which is where we learn through stories of what other people have done. We have modeling, which would be when we imitate the behavior of somebody else, like what we see in the picture. And something you've probably heard many, many times before is that humans are social creatures, right? We are extremely social. We actually get a large majority of our information from other people, which means that a lot of our beliefs and our attitudes are acquired by watching or imitating other people. At a biological level, so there was some science, I'm just kidding, we actually know that there are specific neurons that fire in the motor cortices, and their purpose only seems to be to help us to sort of understand and empathize with the movements of other people. So essentially they are critical for empathy. These are called mirror neurons. And an example of this would be if you ever see somebody carrying a really heavy box or a really heavy object through a crowd, and you look at the faces of the people around them who are watching him or her, you notice that they have this look of discomfort, right? Because all of them can understand what it's like to carry a really heavy object. Well, these neurons also fire synchronously with the other person's neurons in their motor cortex. And it results in us being able to empathize and understand why people do things the way that they do or how people do things. So essentially, as I said before, essential for forming empathy. We also know that we're more likely to empathize with people who have very similar words or beliefs or actions to those that we have. And because we are more likely to empathize and to group ourselves with people who are more like us, we group people together based on whether they're similar or whether they're different. We call these in-groups and out-groups. You're probably familiar with these terms if you ever took a psych class. In-groups are just people who share characteristics with us. So we have formed in-groups where we choose, let's say we have a hobby in-group where we relate to people who share hobbies with us. Maybe they also like golfing or reading or crocheting or knitting or whatever it is that we like to do. And then we also have assigned in-groups, which would be things that we didn't choose, but are essentially features of who we are. So that can include things like our sex, our race, our ethnicity, etc. All of those are assigned groups, meaning that you're sort of assigned an in-group that share characteristics with you as well. You also have out-groups, and out-groups are going to be groups of people who don't share characteristics with you. And this is an important conversation because we know that we treat people in our in-groups and our out-groups completely differently. We favor the people that are in our in-groups, not just by giving them things or doing things for them or being more polite to them, but we actually think of them entirely differently. We give them a very complex set of personality traits. We give them the benefit of moral complexity, so they're not just good people or bad people, they're good in certain situations. Maybe they're they have flaws, right? And they're allowed to have flaws and still be good people, versus the people in the out-groups, which we tend to think of not as individuals, but as members of the group, and we assign them the same characteristics as that group. So we also know that we use our expectations or top-down processing, which we talked about before, and apply sort of our expectations and our beliefs about the entire group when we meet somebody from that new group. So if we meet somebody from an out group, we're less likely to think about who they are as a person and give them those really complex set of traits. And we're more likely to sort of filter what information we remember about them through our expectations for the group that they belong to. So let me give you an example. So start by thinking of a group you're part of. You can go silly or you can go serious. You can think about a group that you share a common interest with. Maybe you enjoy gardening, or you can think of an assigned in group. So think about people who share the same gender or same sex as you. So just think of that, keep that group in mind. And then describe somebody, and this can be just to yourself, it doesn't have to be in the chat box, but who is in the same group as you. So give them the benefit of some adjectives, give them some nuance. Describe that person. Can be in your mind, can be on a piece of paper, in the chat box if you'd like. All right, so now that we sort of have that idea, describe the group as a whole. You chose a group. Let me say I'm going to choose a group of people who also like to eat Mexican food, preferred food and food I grew up with. I would describe somebody else who I know has that characteristic, and then I would describe that group as a whole. Again, you can do this to yourself as a thought, on a piece of paper, chat box. All right, so now describe somebody in a group that is different from you. So think of an out group, somebody who has characteristics or traits that you don't share. So go ahead and try and describe that person in some detail. And we'll just take a couple more seconds. And lastly, describe the out group as a whole. So an example of an out group, I think I gave a couple before, would be a church you don't go to, or a religion you're not part of, or a hobby that you don't enjoy, right? Or somebody who doesn't look like you. All of those are out groups. Try describing the whole group as a whole. So we'll just take a couple of seconds for that. So how similar, when you think about your descriptions of the person in the out group and the out group as a whole, how similar were those two descriptions? Feel free to answer in the chat. So how similar were your descriptions of the group you're not part of and the person that you were thinking of that was part of the group you weren't part of? Interesting, Anissa, you said different. Was it easier to summarize the whole in-group or the whole out-group? When you thought about summarizing the entire group, the one that you shared characteristics with, or the entire group that you didn't share characteristics with, which one of those was simpler? Feel free to share. So often we find that when we describe an out-group and we describe somebody from that out-group, the definition or the description of the group and then the description of the person is very different, unless we've engaged in something like subtyping, which is where we created really an entire new box for them to fit into. And it's also a lot easier to summarize the group that we don't belong to from the group that we belong to, because we assign the groups that we belong to much more complex descriptions, right? So like I said before, you have a lot more complexity. You tend to give people individuality. So it's much harder to sort of lump everybody into one group. Versus when we think about a group that we don't belong to, it's easier to come up with just sort of a short list of adjectives that describes that group. So I don't know how many of you guys participated in this particular activity, but I do hope that you found it helpful. All right, let's go ahead and continue on. Nope, and I forgot to summarize. So the reason we talk about in-groups and out-groups, right, is because we want to make sure that when we're thinking about out-groups, we do something that's very difficult for our brain, which is giving people the benefit of the doubt, and as much as possible, giving people leeway to have individual traits that are not part of the groups they're part of. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to effective biases on mental health. One of the things that we know is that implicit biases, by their nature, because they're implicit, are not things that we necessarily know to be true about ourselves. They often contradict our explicit attitudes, beliefs, opinions about the world. And when we have this contradiction between attitudes or an attitude and behavior, it results in something called cognitive dissonance, which is an extremely uncomfortable feeling. So for example, we can know that smoking is really bad for us, but we could smoke anyways, right? And this actually results in a very uncomfortable, kind of stressed feeling whenever we engage in smoking, because we know that it's a behavior that's very bad for us, that's very dangerous, but we do it anyways. There's a couple of different ways that we can ease cognitive dissonance. We can change our behavior. So with the example I gave you, we can stop smoking or decide, or we can change our attitude. So we can decide that the science is exaggerated on smoking. And it's a lot easier to change attitudes than behavior. So often people, when they're faced with cognitive dissonance, so this feeling of discomfort, they change their attitudes rather than their behaviors. This is why you'll see people who are faced with evidence of being biased, they'll often sort of change their attitudes, right? So they'll change what they believe is right and what is wrong, even to a small extent, so that they don't feel that feeling of discomfort, or they withdraw from the conversation. When we're in a place where we can't change our attitudes or behaviors, it often becomes extremely uncomfortable and it makes us very anxious. And that's when we see people who avoid difficult conversations. There's a good reason for that, right? It's making them anxious or uncomfortable, and they can't see a way of either changing their attitudes or their behaviors. So let's go ahead and do a quick activity. A lot of us have cognitive dissonance and aren't aware of it. So I actually borrowed this from a wonderful professor who does a cognitive dissonance activity. So we're going to complete two very quick surveys. One is called the attitude survey, one is called the behavior survey. And we're going to see if we can recreate the feeling of cognitive dissonance. So I'm going to go ahead and put both of those in the chat box. That's the activity, or the attitude survey. And then I'll also put in the behavior survey. So give me a second. I'm going to post right here. So again, that's going to be the behavior worksheet, the second one, and the attitude worksheet is the second one, or the first one, I'm sorry. So let's go ahead and take about a minute or two to complete those. You're free to do them or not do them. I hope you will. And then we'll come back together and we'll discuss. So if we could complete both of the different surveys, and then we'll come back together. So I'm going to check back in exactly 1 minute. And again, if you missed the instructions before, we're completing both the attitudes and the behavior surveys. All right, so I'm going to mute, and then I will come right back to you. Oh, thank you, Anissa. I'm sorry about that. I'll add those back in. So that's going to be the behavior survey. Thank you for that catch, Anissa. I appreciate it. My apologies, everybody. I'm reposting them right now. So the first one that I posted was the behavior worksheet, and this is the attitude worksheet. Sorry about that. And complete both of those. They're in the chat box, so we should be able to all see it now. Oh, you are absolutely correct. I'm sorry about that, Holly. And I actually am seeing a note at the bottom that they took the particular activity down. So that must have happened in the last couple of days. Well, that's unfortunate. If I can find a similar activity, I'll go ahead and update the links here so that you can experience it maybe after the fact. I don't want to take our time by finding a new activity right now. So that is unfortunate, but it happens. Thank you, Kelsey. So Kelsey's saying that you have to copy and paste the entire thing. So I think that, so I think it is a PDF link, but I think that they did actually move the link. That's fine. All right, so if you want to go ahead and copy and paste the entire thing all the way to where it says .pdf and paste it in a address bar, then that should work. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Thank you, London. I appreciate it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and reset my timer, and we're not going to take too much time on this since we've already taken a little bit of time. We'll come back and we'll talk about it here in a second. All right, so just checking back in since it's been a minute. If you could just write done once you're done in the chat box, and that way I know that it's a good time for us all to move on. All right, so let's take a couple more seconds to finish up, and then we'll go ahead and continue on. So let's go ahead and continue on now. I know you might not have had a chance to finish the whole worksheet, but that's totally fine. Let's go ahead and answer the poll question. Anissa, if you want to put it up, and then we'll discuss. So think about whether you experienced, first of all, whether your answers to both surveys were the same, and whether you experienced that sort of uncomfortable telltale sign of cognitive dissonance. Perfect. All right, so the majority of participants did experience it. Perfect. That's totally normal for it to be a bit uncomfortable when we notice that our attitudes and our behavior aren't matching. And this is also true, as I mentioned before, of experiencing or understanding that we have biases. In fact, a lot of people who, when they take the IAT, experience this really profound sense of discomfort when they see the results, because it's something that you didn't realize about yourself, and something that you're not necessarily comfortable with about yourself either. All right, let's go ahead and continue on. I want to give you sort of an example that's probably near and dear to this particular audience, since both NAMI and Samaritan Counseling Center focus on mental health stigma. This is probably a pretty familiar type of prejudice and discrimination and stereotype that a lot of us have experienced. And it's something that is often sort of, mental illnesses are often sort of misportrayed or portrayed poorly in different movies and TV shows, which can create a lot of those biases or stereotypes that we're familiar with. We often see people who have mental illnesses portrayed as dangerous, and that's often something that people erroneously think, even though people with mental illness are much more likely to be victims of rather than perpetrators of crime. So we are all familiar with being on the wrong end of a couple of different biases. The fear that people experience can sometimes lead them to discriminate against people with mental illnesses and or to create discriminatory policies. And we also know that on the other side of things, those with mental illnesses are also a lot less likely to receive fair treatment within the healthcare system and to get the healthcare that they need. So I just want to point this out as an example. I think that a lot of what I talked about before can seem sort of theoretical, but this is one particular example of bias that many of us have already experienced before in our lives and might experience again. All right. I believe that we have time for this conversation, so we'll go through it pretty quickly. Has anybody, if you're willing to share, in this particular audience experienced a mental health stigma or know somebody who's experienced mental health stigma, and how do you think that stigma may have formed? Extra points if you can use some of the cognitive concepts we've talked about. Again, you don't have to be willing to share, but if you want to, that's fine. This is actually something I talk fairly extensively with my students. One of the first things we do when we talk about our psychological disorders chapter in Psych 100 is we actually think about all of the things that we've heard that are not true about people with depression and anxiety. And even though it shouldn't surprise me anymore, it still surprises me how many times I hear things that are just wrong when it comes to mental illnesses. So I'm sure some of us have experienced this in the past, but again, I don't want to force anybody to share. Absolutely, that's a great thing that you bring up, because there's definitely there definitely can be a cultural aspect to stigma. I know in the culture that I come from, there's certainly a stigma associated with the mental health industry. There's a sort of stigma of it being weak to accept help for mental health or mental illness. Yeah, that's a great example, Anissa. Absolutely. So a lot of people will sort of infer or suggest that it's sort of a consequence of your own poor lifestyle instead of an actual physical mental illness or physical illness. All right, absolutely. Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of us have experienced this particular form of bias. It's something that I've experienced as well, personally, and also I've had friends who've dealt with this as well. So it definitely makes this particular conversation much more personal for me. So what we're going to talk about here in a few minutes is how we can help eradicate not just mental health stigma, but how we can eradicate things like bias in general. On the other side of things, so on the side of things that where people are actually experiencing discrimination, like what we just talked about with mental health stigma, we know that individuals who experience discrimination are more likely to experience mental health problems like anxiety, depression. It can worsen mental health issues that they already have. We also know that it can result in things like other physical health problems like heart disease, diabetes. You're actually more at risk for diabetes if you experience frequent discrimination, and then various different illnesses caused by stress. So it's a very real problem that we need to address. All right, so I'd say probably the most important part of this conversation is what can we actually do about bias? Because if it's so ingrained in your brain, how on earth do you fix something that is sort of a natural part of the way that we think? And we absolutely can address it. And the best tactic is to address it at multiple levels. So we can address our own bias, we can address other people's bias, and largely ultimately we have to talk about it on a systemic level as well, because unless you address sort of systemic levels of bias, you're just going to have the continuous perpetuation of individual bias as well. So let's start with a conversation about addressing your own biases. There's a lot that you can do here. One of my favorite activities, because I'm a huge bio nerd or a neuroscience nerd, is something called retraining your associational networks. We talked before about schemas and in-groups and out-groups. One of the most simple things that you can do is whenever you see somebody from an out-group, so somebody who doesn't look like you or act like you, displayed in a very negative way. So you see somebody in a group being put into a cop car or in handcuffs. Imagine them in your mind. Picture that exact same person doing something that you really like. So if you like reading books, imagine them reading with you, or imagine them playing golf with you. And even though this seems like a very silly exercise, it's actually an easy way to retrain your brain to reassociate those folks into one of your in-groups. And it actually does work. There's actually quite a bit of evidence that suggests that this is a very helpful mechanism for changing up our associational networks. It essentially teaches the neural networks in your brain, or the way that your neurons are grouped together, to associate new pathways that weren't associated before. So you can create sort of either a different group, or you can add people into your in-group that weren't maybe necessarily in your neural in-group before. We can also talk about memory consolidation. So another helpful tip would be just to read books and articles, watch TV shows and movies. I actually added a list there that is pretty comprehensive of pretty good books, articles, TV shows, movies, documentaries, etc., various different things to start with to explore different types of inequality, but especially racism. And it's especially helpful to read these things before bed because we actually consolidate a lot of our memories while we sleep. So that would be your friendly neuroscientist tip. And don't just watch TV shows or read books where it's talking about racism, but read books and or different types of bias, but also just read books and watch movies and TV shows where people, the main character doesn't look like you, just doing normal daily things. It's actually even more helpful in some ways than reading about things like systemic bias, although that's also useful. It's also very helpful, especially in addressing things like cognitive dissonance, to use something called mindfulness, which is where we sort of exist in the present without judging ourselves. So try a very simple breathing exercise where you just breathe in deeply and out deeply, and explore how you feel about something or somebody, and then think about what comes up and try not to judge it too much. Judging ourselves for bias is not particularly useful. It's a lot more useful to actually think about ways that we can eliminate it, right? So being judgmental with ourselves is not very helpful. And lastly, acknowledging that we have cognitive dissonance and that we probably all have biases at some level because of the world that we're in, and acknowledging that discomfort and that it exists and being okay with it, which is a lot easier said than done, I think. All right. So let me give you an example of retraining your neural networks, which again is something I use a lot. So let me give you a very simple example. Think about somebody in your outgroups. This could be, let's see. I don't know if I need to give you more examples of outgroups, but if you play golf, it would be all the people that don't play golf. That's a silly example. It could be somebody that doesn't look like you, right? Again, be as silly or as serious as you are comfortable within your own brain. So think about somebody in your outgroup and think about the first several words that come to mind. And don't judge yourself if they're particularly negative. Just let them be whatever comes to mind. So once you have a firm picture of that person and you've described them in your mind, imagine that person doing something with you that you enjoy. So you could imagine them going for a run with you or taking a hike with you, something that you really like. Put that person in your picture in your mind. And then imagine the person again and think about the first words that come to mind. This is not something you have to share. It can be something that's just personal for you. If you do this often enough, you actually will start to find that when you picture people who enjoy hobbies with you, when you picture people in your mind, you're going to see a much more diverse cast of characters that actually appear in your mind. So it's essentially a neural trick for retraining the schemas that we use. All right, so I hope that was helpful. It's also very helpful to address other people's biases as well. So one helpful thing would be to conquer subtyping. So we know that it takes at least 20 instances of encountering people that don't fit our stereotypes. So go ahead and find those instances, right? Talk to people that don't look like you or think like you or act like you. Again, that can be easier said than done because it can be hard to find those people. It is a little bit easier with the internet, so maybe that's one of the few good things that sort of comes along with being at home right now, is being able to reach out to people that you wouldn't normally reach out to, sorry. Introduce your friends to one another. You'd be amazed how helpful this is in diversifying your group, your friend group. Make sure that they know each other, make sure that people who don't think alike know each other. You can definitely be a catalyst for somebody else to address their own stereotypes as well. And then call out stereotypes and prejudices when you see them, which again is also easier said than done. And I would say be wary of this one. Don't call out it's helpful to call out things that you see, but you're also going to exhaust yourself if every single time you see something that annoys you on Facebook, if you talk about it. Pick your battles, I would say, because it can be extremely frustrating otherwise. All right. I would actually like to do a quick activity, and I think we do have time for it, where we can reflect a little bit on our own social circle. So let's think about our own friend group, who we consider friends, and then if you want to, just take a quick second, you could even minimize the Zoom, and scroll through your social media feed for a second if it's something that you use a lot. Think about who you see in your feed and who you don't see represented on your feed. So who's present and who's absent? So take a couple seconds, think about who has the largest voice in your particular social group. And then when you're ready, take a few minutes and find a concrete way that you can actually change up your social group a little bit. And I don't mean eliminating friends. I mean finding an event you can attend virtually, hopefully, a video you can watch, an article you can read. And then if you could, just post it in the chat box once you found it. So we're going to take a minute to do this. And that way we all have some new resources as well. So again, think about an event you can attend, a video you could watch, an article you can read that will help to sort of push your comfort zone a little bit and help you to talk to somebody that you wouldn't normally talk to. So we're gonna take about a minute, maybe 2, we'll see. And then go ahead and post in the chat box when you found something. All right, so just checking in. I don't see anything posted in the chat box yet, so if you are still working on it, let's go ahead and take another couple seconds or maybe a minute, and then we'll come back together. Great example, Jordan. Yeah, I actually really loved that discussion as well. I'm really looking forward to attending that second part. Kelsey. Yeah, you absolutely could read that particular article. It's always good to know what people who don't think like you or are thinking about or talking about. Although I always sort of try and go into it steeling myself for what I'm going to read, I think. All right, so just a couple seconds if anybody else wants to add anything. And I think here it's important to note that, well, it's important to push our comfort zones. Like I talked about in the very beginning, it's very important to also think about evidence, right? So we talked at the beginning about speaking without evidence, right? We always want to make sure that we're evaluating the claims we have. I don't think I need to tell you folks that, but always thinking about where things are coming from, that sort of thing. All right, so let's go ahead and move along. I did see a couple of you had posted in the chat box, so thank you very much. There are some really wonderful events actually on Facebook that I highly recommend taking a look at that are coming up that are sort of, I know that there was a prosecution forum, which I've heard some very good things about from several people. There's a couple of other political events that are coming up as well that I highly recommend. All right. So we can also address biases on a policy level. So like I mentioned before, it's important that we think about things not just on sort of an individual level, but also how do we make systemic change. So none of these are going to be groundbreaking suggestions, I think, but listen to the people that experienced discrimination and their experiences, but don't expect them to teach you about it, right? Because that's our responsibility. Listen to people who are making policy. So there's, like I said before, one of the great things about, maybe one of the only great things about this particular situation is that because a lot of things have been moved online, there is more access to forums that are created by decision makers and things like virtual debates that you can actually attend. So listening to the people who are actually creating policies and most importantly, voting, right? So voting for people who you feel strongly about and who you feel like are going to support policies that don't encourage bias. All right. So I think for one of the first times in my life, I'm actually finishing on time. So we have time for a reflection. So in our reflection, let's think about a couple of different things. Were there any revelations we had in the workshop? So is there a way that you've experienced bias, or did you notice that during this workshop that you held, what is one thing that we can commit to of the strategies that we talked about, that we can, a way that we can commit to changing our own biases or biases of others? Let's focus especially on that last question. So what is one way we would like to change our biases or the biases of others? And again, we can write this in the chat box. If you'd rather it be a personal commitment, that's totally fine as well. Absolutely. So I'm actually seeing a lot of really good answers in the chat box. I think for myself, it's a lot about finding more information that I wouldn't normally digest and taking the time to digest it. And then also helping my husband out, who's sort of more engaged in the policy side of things. So we can continue, obviously, this thought train, but I do want to end with this quote. Alone we can do so little, and together we can do so much. And I just want to say, at least from a neuroscientist perspective, one of the most fascinating things about thinking about the human brain or researching the human brain is that we're the only species that actually has an entire science dedicated to studying our own brains using our own brains, which I think is just wonderfully meta and impressive. But it also makes us the only species that we're aware of that can actually think about our flaws and address those flaws. And because it's such a powerful thing, I think it also means that we have the obligation to do it. So that's sort of my little soapbox. I do think that when we have the opportunity to, we should absolutely think about the ways that our brains are imperfect, the ways that our views of the world are distorted. And when we can correct those distortions, we should do so. And I believe that's it. So that's all I have for you today. Wendy, did you want to say a few words?
Yeah, before we wrap up, we do have an evaluation that I'd like for everyone to complete. So I'll go ahead and post it in the chat box. If you could just click that link and take a few moments to do it. It shouldn't take any more than a minute to complete. But if you could just click that and do that and then come back, and maybe we'll wrap up with some thank yous and finish up some questions. So I'll just go ahead and give a few moments for you to do that. Okay, so as we're wrapping up the survey, I just wanted to say thank you again to Anika. That was an amazing presentation. And I have no doubt that we learned a lot, and that time to just sit back and reflect it was really good. So thank you. I also wanted to I see a few questions floating around if we're going to have the presentation recorded. Will it be sent out? So yes, we'll definitely send that out to everyone who attended. So that'll be available. It should be available for at least a week. So we'll send that in the next few days. Are there any other questions that anyone wanted to pose to Anika? You can feel free to type them in the chat box or put them in the Q&A. So I'll give a few moments just for people to do that. Okay, so it looks like we have one question. Are there any good audio or podcast you'd recommend related to this topic?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jordan. It's kind of hard to choose one. There's a bunch. I've actually been reading more than I have been listening, but I would recommend anything that Ibrahim Kendi posts. I think that he also had, oh my goodness, was he the one that was just doing the podcast? I absolutely loved the book that I just read by him, but I know that there was one called Save the People. I'm trying to look it up because I couldn't remember. Code Switch, that was the one I was thinking of. Code Switch is absolutely fantastic. So I couldn't think of the exact name. It's actually by NPR. Yes, it is by NPR. So I just want to make sure I don't give the wrong information. So yeah, I would absolutely recommend that one. That one's from 2016, but still relevant, which tells you it's been an issue that's been going on for a while.
Yes, that is a really good one. I personally recommend that one too. Another question, is there such a thing as good bias? Are there biases that keep us safe, i.e. women avoiding a place with lots of men, people of color not wanting to go to predominantly white areas?
Yes, I would say that bias in and of itself, like I mentioned before, it does make our brains more efficient. So this is, I think, something I say in every webinar I give, that your brain is really just an organ and it basically prioritizes energy efficiency. So biases all kind of come from the same place, and they certainly can be helpful in some ways, but you have to think about the trade-off there too. So absolutely, it can mean that we avoid danger, which is the number one reason we have biases in the first place, right? If we think about from an evolutionary standpoint, it actually makes sense why we would have a lot of detail about the people who are in our in-groups and not as much detail on the people in our out-groups, right? And why we would have those biases, because they actually helped us to survive, and they still function in that way as well. But it also means that we don't develop relationships in as much depth with people that aren't in our in-groups as well. So I would say yes/no, which is probably an answer I would give to most questions about psychological concepts. It depends, right? So it can function very well from a survival standpoint, in that we avoid things or situations that are dangerous. But when a situation isn't dangerous, it means that maybe we're not meeting somebody who could be a wonderful addition, right, to our social circle. So yes and no.
Great, thank you. I think that's it for questions. Unless anyone has any last minute questions, please feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat box or the Q&A box. And if you think of something after we end today, feel free to email us. And we'll go ahead and put our email and contact information in the chat box, so you'll have that as well. Nope, that's not a question. Okay. So yeah, so I just want to thank Anika for presenting again. It was really great. I want to thank NAMI Hawaii and Anissa for helping us put this together and your support. Thank you to Samaritan Counseling Center, and also thank you to the Honolulu Grants and Aid Program, the City and County of Honolulu, for their support and the grant to put this program together. So we will go ahead and send out the recording, as I said before. We'll also send out some information about our resources and like how to get in touch with us. So Anissa, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, thanks everybody for showing up and being here. And I learned a lot too. And maybe we'll see you for our next one on Saturday.
Yep. So our next one's on Saturday at 9 a.m. and it's on the gut, heart, and brain axis. So it talks about the link between nutrition and mental health. So we'll also send out that information in an email as well. So thank you all for coming and hope to see you on Saturday.